Okay, we thank you for your patience. Now let's begin the first panel discussion. Approaches for developing sustainability disclosure frameworks. The audience are invited to join the Q&A session using the application Slido. For participants at the conference venue, the QR code is printed on the back of your name tag in the next drop, so please submit questions by scanning the QR code on the name tag. Online audience, please submit the questions through the link provided in the chat section. The questions can be submitted either in English or Japanese. Questions can be submitted only during the panel discussion. Ms. Kris Nathanail, a Senior Policy Advisor, IOSCO General Secretariat, will be the moderator for this panel discussion one. So, Ms. Nathanail, the stage is yours.
Thanks very much, and thank you for the kind invitation to be here in Japan today with you all. 5 years ago, if you spoke to most policymakers about sustainability disclosures, you would probably get a blank look on their face, or at least a puzzled one. But investor demand was starting to grow for that kind of information, and that has led to the momentum we have seen with the creation of the ISSB and the excellent work they have done at such fast pace to get us to the standards that are near final today and that we are hoping will be going through the process of the IOSCO endorsement in the future. But the ISSB is only the beginning of the story because it is the global framework that will hopefully underpin national implementations or voluntary use by market participants. So we also need to consider approaches at national level for sustainability disclosures. And to that extent, I am pleased to have the panel that we have here today to discuss those approaches. My name is Kris Nathanail, as you've just heard. I'm a policy advisor, a senior policy advisor at IOSCO. And I have the pleasure to be joined, first of all, by Jean-Paul Servais, our own IOSCO chairman, and up until yesterday, the chairman of the monitoring board, which is responsible for the oversight of the IFRS Foundation. Jean-Paul Servais is also the chairman of the Belgian Financial Services and Markets Authority and has a wealth of experience both at European and international level policymaking. Next to him, Ugo Bassi, who for most of you who are familiar with European processes isn't to be introduced, but for those of you who may not, he is Director of Financial Markets at the European Commission, Director General for Financial Stability, Financial Services and Capital Markets Union, otherwise known colloquially as FISMA in Europe, and he has done that work since 2012. He was responsible for launching the Capital Markets Union project, and that includes the sustainable finance component and the CSRD within that. Paul Munter, Chief Accountant of the US Securities and Exchange Commission, and also responsible for chairing Committee 1 of IOSCO, the committee responsible for accounting, audit, and disclosures, and he happens to also chair the monitoring group. So also a wealth of international experience there. And last but not least, of course, Takashi Nagaoka, who's Deputy Commissioner for International Affairs at Japan's own financial services agency. He's also the Secretary General for the Certified Public Accountants and Auditing Oversight Board, and he has broad experience of financial regulation, both nationally and internationally, being Vice President of EFR and having led other IOSCO work streams in the past. So with those presentations, let's get started with the actual discussion, and let's first dig into those national or regional approaches that we have been talking about. Ugo, I'll start with you. The European Union started on that path for quite a while, probably before many other jurisdictions. What can you tell us about where you are in the process at the moment?
Okay, better. Thank you, Kris. Thank you for the question. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Very happy to be here. It's such a large audience interested in sustainability reporting issues. Yeah, you're right, Chris. The European Union has been quite a pioneer in this field, probably because it has decided politically to be at the front run in the, let's say, climate, but not only in the sustainability, I would say, transition. You may have heard about the very ambitious targets that we set up by 2020, and in particular by 2050, we would like to be the first, or in any event, one of the carbon neutral economy in the world. And therefore, the sustainable finance agenda, which you've mentioned and that I had the pleasure to launch a few years ago, is an important part of this process, because we won't make it without private money. And the sustainable finance agenda is all about channeling private investments towards these objectives. And one of the pillars of this enormous project is precisely the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, which is the current framework which regulates sustainability disclosures in Europe. It's a brand new framework. It has replaced the non-financial reporting directive, which existed already 10 years ago. So again, I realize how we've been pioneers on this. Basically, it requires nowadays companies, and a larger, much broader range and number of companies, to report on the basis of European sustainability standards. And the first standards are being approved. We do this together with an organization which is called EFRAG. This organization was and still is in charge of advising the Commission on financial reporting standards issued by the EASB, and now it is in charge of producing the sustainability standards. Where are we now? We have received as Commission no less than 12 standards that we are looking at. We are consulting on those. 2 standards are of a general nature. 5 standards are related to environment, 4 are related to social issues, and 1 about governance. That shows that at the European level, we are looking at the issue from all the angles of the ESG world, social, environment, and governance. So we are now looking at those drafts proposed by EFRAG. We are consulting. We have the intention to adopt them if everything goes in the right direction by June this year. And EFRAG is already working on another set of standards that will probably give us later on this year for approval at some point next year. So this is to say that we are working at a very high, very quick pace, but of course at the same time we're trying to get it right, and it's a difficult process. Thank you.
June this year is an ominous time for most organizations, it seems. As we heard from the ISSB, they would also be looking to publish the final standards by then. You have been engaging as the European Commission with the ISSB. What can you tell us about your views on their standards?
Well, I can say that alignment and convergence between the standards that we produce at European level and the standards produced by the ISSB, alignment is an objective, and a very important one, because of course we are mindful of the need to make companies' life as easy as possible, and therefore making sure that companies are not obliged to report on the basis of 2 different sets of rules, of standards. Therefore, we've been working together with ISSB for a few months now, and I have to say that I am pretty optimistic that we will be at some point, and sooner than later, I hope, in a comfortable place where, let's say, almost every aspect of the standards converge, and where the elements which do not converge are subject to specific, pragmatic, practical solutions to be offered to, as I said, ultimately make company's life easier. And in that sense, I would like to praise the work done by ISSB, Emmanuel Su, and all the staff, because it is very important that we work in parallel. And although there are nuances, there are differences in the approach, you will hear about it later on. I think that convergence and alignment is of utmost importance. We have an interoperability table we are working on, and we are working, with a view to making it as aligned as possible. I don't want to bother you with details, but it is very important that we converge as much as possible. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ugo. Let me jump to the other side of the Atlantic. Paul, the US SEC published its own consultation back in March, April last year, if my memory doesn't fail me. And I think there's a ominous wait to see when you might be publishing your final standards and what those might look like. Do you mind giving us an update on that?
Sure, I can try to. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be part of the panel here this afternoon. Let me start by doing a little level setting, and our mission is a little bit different than what Ugo was describing. We are an investor protection agency. We are a disclosure-based agency, so it's not within our remit to tell companies what they should or shouldn't do in response to climate risk, or what they should or shouldn't do to manage human capital. It's within our remit to tell companies that to the extent it's material to investors, they should tell investors what they're doing, whatever that happens to be. So we start in a little different place because in the case of Ugo, there are some additional policy objectives that they are trying to achieve beyond just providing information that is decision useful for investors. So our focus is on that, is what information is going to be decision useful for investors. And I have to take you back a little bit because our journey started about 10, 11 years ago. Back in 2010, the SEC issued what we call Commission guidance on climate risk disclosure. It's grounded in general principles of materiality, but essentially says to the extent that climate risks are material, then issuers should describe those and provide transparency around what the potential effects of climate risk are to the company's ongoing operations. So that's been in place for a number of years, and practice is fairly mixed in terms of the degree of granularity that we see in response to the commission level guidance, in terms of what frameworks issuers might look to in trying to determine how to make the disclosures and determine what is material. And so, Kris, as you mentioned, early last year, in March of last year, the Commission developed a proposal that would be more prescriptive in terms of what kinds of things need to be disclosed, particularly around climate risks and strategies and the like, and also around financial statement consequences from weather-related events. Now, in our process, when we issue a proposal, and I'm speaking we being the commission, I'm not a commissioner, so when the 5 commissioners determine that they are going to issue a proposal, it's really designed to achieve two objectives. One is to inform stakeholders what the commissioners are thinking about directly in terms of modifying our disclosure rules that's applicable to issuers. The second objective of a commission proposal is to elicit feedback from stakeholders that can then inform commission thinking that is then used to move towards a final rule. And at least with respect to the second of those two objectives, you have to say that we were enormously successful because we were able to elicit 16,000 responses to our proposal. That's the good news. Now, what that also means is it takes a while to read 16,000 responses, to consider how that affects our thinking. And as you can no doubt guess, the responses are fairly mixed. And so we're still in the process of working through that. In the meantime, we've also had a bit of change in the legal landscape that we are dealing with. And so trying to finalize rules in a fashion that is both responsive to the input that we've received and is also legally sustainable is something that we're still navigating through that process. I don't really have a prediction as to when we will be able to complete that, but I number one, it remains a high priority among the commission. It remains a priority to develop final rules that will help issuers craft their disclosures in a manner that is both informative to investors and more consistent so that investors are better able to make comparisons. And it also remains a priority to think about how the information within an annual report that is provided outside of the financial statements can be appropriately linked to information in the financial statements when there is a financial statement impact from a weather-related event. And some of that we are thinking about, to what degree do we specify quantitative thresholds to trigger disclosure versus relying on general principles of materiality? And there are trade-offs to either of those directions. But we are continuing at a staff level to work very diligently towards an objective of having recommendations that the commission can consider as quickly as possible.
15,000 responses, that's to give you nightmares. So surprised you're here in Tokyo to speak to us about it. Speaking of Tokyo, let's move to Takashi. Takashi, you recently announced here in Japan the implementation of a standards board. Can you tell us a bit about where you are in that process, what that means for the landscape here in Japan, and how that might align with the implementation of ISSB standards going forward?
Thank you, Kris, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As my colleagues sitting here, it is a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to talk about things from the Japanese perspective. And before answering to your question directly, let me give you a broad idea of what's happening in Japan with regard to this sustainability disclosure. The approach taken so far can be categorized into two different streams. One is soft law, if you will. Another is hard law. And in terms of soft law, we have corporate governance code, which has been having multiple revisions according to the changes in environment. And the most recent one was has taken place in June 2021. And this corporate governance code has required the new segment in the Tokyo Exchange, the prime segment. The corporate sectors, corporates listed on that prime segment are required to disclose sustainability information according to the TCFD framework or the equivalent, and further enhancing the content both in volume and quality. So those are required on a soft law basis. And turning to the hard law basis, in January this year, we have introduced a template for annual securities report, which is statutory report. And we introduced a new column covering sustainability information, including climate change and human capital. And by creating this column, the corporate sector need to fill in that column, hence enough sustainability information to the investors. And this new column will be in effect from the reports coming out from April, I think. So the year-end reports as of March 2023 will be the first application, and thereafter that'll be implemented. So that was put in place. But you would ask, do you have a standard for disclosing that information, filling that column in the statutory securities report? And frankly, there is none that is authorized specifically for that. And this is because we took an immediate response to the growing needs of the investors for sustainability information. So this is the first step, only first step. And the second step will be coming back to you. Our national standards setter, Sustainability Standards Board of Japan, which will be developing Japanese standards that is consistent with ISSB standard. And this point, consistent with ISSB standard, is the important part. And right now, this SSBJ is expecting to finalize and publish its final set of standards by March 2025. So it's going to be 2 years' time. And we consider it very important that we have some visible timeline in place when we develop this kind of standard, so that people can have a clear expectation on what's happening going forward. So that's about it for the development phase.
Thanks very much, Takashi. Jean-Paul, let me come to you. We've heard from 3 big jurisdictions, but a lot of the smaller ones are waiting for IOSCO to make its assessment on whether or not to endorse the ISSB standards once those are ready, before deciding on whether to implement them. Now, IOSCO has some experience of that, as we endorsed the IASB standards back a couple of decades ago. What can you tell us about the current assessment?
Thank you, Kris. I was a little bit stressed by the start of your question, because you were speaking about 3 big jurisdictions. I was stressed that you would see the 4th one is Belgium, which is absolutely not the case. It's a very small jurisdiction. Now, allow me, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, to tell you that, frankly speaking, it's a real privilege but also a pleasure to talk to you at today's conference of our colleagues and friends from the GFSA about sustainable disclosure. And I have to also to tell that's a real pleasure for me to be back in Japan, a kind of tradition for me for more than 35 years. I would like to give you some comment, I would say, with my capacity of IOSCO chair, but also I would say as outgoing chair of the monitoring board. And as you stressed some minutes ago, as you know, ladies and gentlemen, the IFRS monitoring board is overseeing, I would say, the quality of the work, decision-making, due process of the IFRS Foundation. And I also would like to take the opportunity to wish Takashi, my colleague and friend for the GFSA, Takashi Nagaoka, the new chair from today. All the best and every success. It was a pleasure to work with him and my colleague during more than 6 years, I would say, as chairman of the monitoring board. And that will be, in fact, my last word, I would say, in this capacity of a public comment. What about now the ongoing work as a new chair of IOSCO? First of all, allow me to tell that this kind of discussion we need to have that at global level. And that's the reason why I think, not by definition, but in this kind of discussion, that IOSCO can have a real added value. First of all, because I think, even if I'm not objective, let us as chair of IOSCO, that we are a real and rather unique global membership organization, because IOSCO, it means that it's a membership organization. It's a consensus. We never vote. It's a consensus-based organization. And all our members are involved in various capacity in the supervision of 95% of all the financial sector around the world. Yes, 95%. We have the pleasure to work with more than 130 jurisdictions, and it means also that the majority of our colleagues are representative of supervisory body in charge of the financial sector of growth and emerging market. And why do I stress that? Not in order to make publicity for the IOSCO work, but because I think that if we want to speak about the latest development in the field of sustainability disclosure, that must be done from a global perspective. And I was very impressed, as usual, by the comment made by this wise man, Erkki Liikanen. Yesterday we had the pleasure to have a wonderful stakeholders dinner managed by the Japanese community, and thanks again for that. And the first comment, correct me, Erkki, was to say, okay, we all know that there are, I would say, risk of fragmentation arising from geopolitical tension. So you would say that's not the momentum to discuss about this kind of global risk. But at the contrary, so your comment was, so what? No. There is something which is important for many, many people, and all the people in this room, is climate change risk. And that means that it calls for a globally coordinated response. And why does it, I think, why is there a need for a global response? First of all, because there is a momentum. There is a momentum. And what does it mean, a momentum? Is that what all these ladies and gentlemen are doing just in front of me, I would say the IFRS Foundation, the ISSB and ISSB, they are trying to develop standards, first of all, that are expected by investors. You would say it's normal. No, it's not normal. Let us be clear. I can tell you, I would say, that's an event for me, a scope on the beat in the financial sector for more than 20 years, which happens once in a lifetime. I know the second time in my career. The first one, it was after the subprime crisis in 2008, with the enhancement of Basel standards requirement for the banking supervision, the switch from Basel II, which was not successful, as you know, to Basel III. That was very fast, I would say, at the time, and Erkki was also there, but in another capacity in less than 1 year, due to the, I would say, the push made by many people, and of course, Jean-Claude Trichet, at this time, the chair of the ecosystem in Basel. But it was a negative agenda, how to draw lessons that we had to learn from a crisis, and we did it, and it was the right decision. Here we are speaking about a positive agenda. There is no crisis as such from a financial point, but their expectation of, I think, all of you, not because you are in a professional life, but because you are maybe investor. You would like to understand in which product, in which companies you could invest, entities which are in line with ESG expectation. For this, you would like to have a global toolkit. That's the second reason why there is a momentum and why we need a global response. How to create together one single language for issue, which doesn't mean that we don't take into account national specificity. And we see that Of course, there are differences between jurisdictions, but at the end of the day, I would say there is a capacity to build bridges. That's also maybe the added value of IOSCO. Third aspect, how to promote investor protection and address risk of greenwashing. Yes, we must avoid to be naive, I would say. There is also a negative part of the agenda. Help financial market in pricing risk. 4 reasons why there is a momentum. Let us be clear. The job of the financial sector is not to find solutions from a technological point of view about how to find. The job of the financial regulator, standard setter, supervisor, and financial player is to have a need value in order to see how we can channel savings to targets which are in line with, I would say, the ESG expectation. And last but not least, of course, how to help, how to have an added value about financial stability, and this by identifying. And that's the reason why I think that we need to have a global, I would say, a global answer. For this, let us be just, and I will close my remark with that, with a timeline. First step, Erki. Second step, Emmanuel and his colleagues. And last but not least, I would say the community of people involved in value capacity at international level, at IOSCO level, at regional level, Ugo, and at national level, Paul and Takashi. As you can see, you would be surprised if I tell you that we are competing against each other. Doesn't look like that. We have excellent relationship, but also I think that we have to take into account some national specificity. But let us be clear, the first step was important. The first step, that was the announcement made by Erki, less than 18 months ago. That was one of the 2 good news of the, from a financial point of view, I would say the so-called Finance Day, because there is a Finance Day in every edition of the COP. It was the COP26 in Glasgow, less than 18 months ago, saying, okay, we dare take the initiative to launch another body in the IFRS Foundation ecosystem. It was less than 18 months. After that, you will see everything is there. Everything is there. A new board, new people, diversity, gender, geographic, multi-location compromise, with also, of course, as stressed by the Prime Minister rightly, a hub in Japan, which already exists for 10 years. And then the capacity to prototype, to launch a prototype, and now S1 and S2. And last but not least, the capacity to bring together a lot of human resources coming from different standards which already merge between them. That's impressive, let us be clear. And it means capacity now to finalize their work as soon as possible. And that's the second step with Emmanuel and his board, and also with the support of the IFRS Foundation. I see the Director General, Lee White, just in front of me. It means the connectivity with Andreas Berkhoff and the ISSB. Latest meeting in Montreal, 16th of February, not last year, less than 1 month. Okay? Again, on track. Again, just in time. I know that Japan was the country of just-in-time management philosophy in the 60s with inventory management. But that's another good example of just-in-time management with a final decision on all the technical content of its climate and its general requirement standard. So with their substance now fully agreed and to be challenged, I would say, with the famous and well-known IFRS language, pre-ballot, ballot. And so unanimously, correct me, Emmanuel, unanimously approved, it means the capacity to start final balloting process. And it means also that, and that was very important also to stress that in fact there was another step even before the first step, that was the TCFD, Michael Bloomberg. And I know the added value of this TCFD, especially in many Asian countries and of course Japan by definition. And it was important because the objective is to ensure protection, consumer protection, but also capacity for the issuer, the preparers, to take on board. It means a lot of knowledge, even for me. I can tell you, I had to engage a lot of people in Belgium for that. I am very happy. So it means capacity, as a co would say, we need to teach the teacher, and that's for sure. I would say that, and therefore we need to have a step-by-step approach, and that's the reason why rightly ISSB has built an existing market accepted framework and standard. And last but not least, if I may call it that, the IOSCO framework. I think that I may say even that an objective that in parallel we have been very active at IOSCO level. We developed and published the assessment framework. Let us be clear. If we want to have trust and support from our citizens, from an investor, we need to explain that there is a decision-making process. There is a due process. There is the capacity to challenge the quality. The speed is important, but not against the quality of the decision-making public consultation. And within also legitimacy, the fact that IOSCO, which is in fact the community of financial supervisors all around the world, is involved in this assessment is important. And that's the reason why we agreed, I would say, a framework which set out the agreed criteria against which IOSCO will independently assess the finalized standards in anticipation of our potential endorsement decision. And that's the reason why I was so glad to see, and also that was, I would say, the kind of dialogue that we had with the trustee this morning. I think that the ISB announcement made last month enable IOSCO to move forward with our independent assessment of the ISSB standard in terms of quality and governance with a view of completing our review this year. I think that on a private and professional life, we need challenges, we need deadline, and the objective is to be back to the market, the stakeholders, with a, I would say, fully fledged comprehensive toolkit of financial sustainable finance reporting, but also Asian standards, I would say, before the end of 2024, in order to be used, if possible, at the level of judgment. We would like to start with that for the year-end 2024 accounts to be released somewhere in 2025. That's the objective, and I think that we must be optimistic and doer for that because our citizens are waiting for that.
Thanks very much, Jean-Paul. A very busy agenda for IOSCO ahead of us as well. I take away a few points from what you said, but perhaps the main one is the need to ensure as much as possible this consistency which the ISSB will seek to bring to the table, also having due regard to national specificities or regional specificities where they exist. And I think that's a nice segue into the second part of the conversation, which really is about that question of interoperability, which Hugo has also mentioned when he mentioned his engagement with the ISSB and their staff. I've got a question here from someone who mentions the concerns around ensuring that the information remains comparable. And of course, before all this work started, we'd started with a so-called alphabet soup of different frameworks and requirements, even though they were coming out of the industry itself. We're now moving on to the legislative side, but it's important to avoid that and to promote that consistency and comparability. Ugo, if I can start with you again, given you raised interoperability first, what do you see as the most significant challenges in ensuring and achieving that interoperability between the European framework and the ISSB one at the moment?
I said it already a little bit. I mean, the problem is that we come from different angles, and we have there are differences in the standards that we are adopting or about to adopt, and of course this is the challenges that they are different. There are differences. I mean, just to mention one is the fact, as I said, that Europe is going for the total spectrum of sustainability, while the ISSB, for example, has started with climate change. So, and the rest will come. So there is an issue of timing here, which needs to be reconciled. Also, the degree of granularity might differ, of course, in the different standards. And the challenge is precisely that while at the same time we want to maintain the information comparable because, as you said, the concern is precisely that the information is no longer comparable, and then we miss the point. On the other hand, of course, we don't want to impose two or even more different sets of standards, of rules to be respected. So this is the real challenge. But as I said before, is a challenge that we are facing with enthusiasm on the one end, at least in the dealings that we're having up until now, the bilateral dealings that we're having between Europe and ISSB. And of course, the idea and the hope is that similar exercises will be carried out also by those jurisdictions which do not belong to the system. Of course, this is not the issue now around this table, but let's say the hope is that those standards would be, let's say, applicable in a way worldwide, because in a world which is still global, that we like it or not, this is very, very important. So the challenge are natural and intrinsic and come from the fact that there is not identity, but precisely we have to see and to work around concept of similarity, of convergence, of alignment, of that's why we talk about global baseline. That's what we support. We support a global baseline on the basis of which minor divergences could be, and as I said before, solved with the practical solutions. I think that here the role of the standard setters and the policymakers who work around and together with the standard setters, that's the case for the Commission with respect to IFRAC, is really to look at this issue from a practical perspective and from an efficiency point of view. We are really introducing new dynamics in the world. It is really important that we do it while keeping the interest of the business community always very clear in mind. So no race to to being the first one or to be the best one. Just really work together in order to make those specificities that Jean-Paul was mentioning, let's say an opportunity rather than a problem. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugo. Paul, building upon what Hugo said, Europe started with a different lens, but it sounds like they're being optimistic about alignment and interoperability with the ISSB. The US SEC proposals, on the other hand, also have that investor-focused approach that the ISSB has, and in many ways also built on TCFD in the same way as the ISSB did. What are your views on that question of alignment and interoperability? Do you think it might be easier to achieve based on your proposed rules, or do you still see challenges?
Well, as you say, Kris, there are some advantages that we have, perhaps. One is both our agency and the ISSB is developing standards or rules through the lens of information that's going to be useful for investors. So that's a common starting point. As you rightly note, both started grounded in a TCFD framework, so that's helpful. One other advantage that we have that Takashi and colleagues don't have is we're also working in English, which takes away one other challenge that exists in a number of other jurisdictions. So there's a lot that's very helpful in trying to achieve alignment between ourselves and where the ISSB is. And I think there's another element as well. Just as I told you a moment ago, I can't predict when we might issue final rules. That also means I couldn't begin to predict once we do when those final rules would take effect. So I think there's also the possibility that we could see in our jurisdiction voluntary use of ISSB standards for a period of time, perhaps in advance of when our rules might come into play, which can also be helpful in informing practice and allowing perhaps larger issuers that might have more resources to develop processes and practices that could be helpful for others. So I think there's a lot of ways that a high degree of alignment potentially can be achieved. All that being said, there will also inevitably be questions that arise in practice as issuers are actually taking the words on the page and trying to apply them in their own facts and circumstances. There will be questions that will arise. And so having mechanisms in place that will help deal with those issues in practice, whether it's developing additional application guidance or having some kind of a forum for open discussion and dialogue of these questions, I think are things that may be needed and might have the potential to drive a greater degree of alignment in the long term.
Thanks, Paul. That's really helpful. Takashi, of course, your process, as you were explaining to us, is underway. But I've got a question here that it would be quite helpful to hear your thoughts on, and that is what direct or indirect effects you expect for Japanese companies from international sustainability regulations, such as the one that we will have with the ISSB standards, but potentially as well with the CSRD.
That's not an easy question to answer, is it? Well, of course, the corporate sector, how they do business, how they approach all the regulations in different countries, they differ. So if we try to implement something international directly in there, there might be frictions there. But at the end of the day, if the Japanese economy is operating within the border alone, then we can just talk about it in that manner. But we are talking about internationalized, globalized world, and in that, there are things that we have to adjust to, and things that we need to adjust the standards in that. So it's both ways, and it's going to be a balance somewhere. And I'm very sure that SSBJ will be taking care of it in terms of standards, and us at the FSA will be taking care of it in the form of regulation. But sorry, I'm not really giving you a direct answer. But can I go back to interoperability and alignment in standards? I think this keyword alignment in standards is really important. As you said, Kris, we were in a world where the standards were like alphabet soup, and then we have come this far. And I must congratulate and commend what has been done by ISSBJ and ISSB, sorry, no J. ISSB and all the others who are involved in the program. But still, there are remaining issues of interoperability. And one observation we can have is that it's in general sense, but sooner we take things on board, the better we are in getting alignment. If we have a core such as ISSB standards, then it would be easier compared to the situation where we don't have that to have alignment. If you have a core, it's easier to compare things and then bring things together towards that direction. So having that core earlier in the stage is very, very important from my perspective. And we have been taking care of climate change so far, but there are tons of things that we need to think about in terms of sustainability, information disclosure. And as our Prime Minister has mentioned, human capital is one of the key agenda in Japan's context. The new form of capitalism policy that our government is progressing, this one includes this notion of investment to human capital. This is very important in the sense that investment in human capital forms the foundation for sustainable value creation by the corporate sector. And if the disclosure is well done, investors will make their money flow into that sector, thus economic growth sustained. And is this Japan-specific issue? It is not actually. You see movements in sustainability disclosure covering human resource and human capital in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere. And if we leave it as such and then let individual jurisdiction come up with their own standards and own regulations in these fields, again, we will be meeting the risk of fragmentation, a lot of challenges for interoperability, etc. In the future. So I think it is very important that we start soon on these new issues, biodiversity, human capital, etc. So that will be like precluding the large challenges and big risks coming in the future. And well, since we, Japan, we have the honor of having the presidency for G7 this year. G7 as a group collectively will be pushing forward this sustainability disclosure issue, including human capital, going forward this year. So if there are needs in the standard setting sphere, and then if there are needs from the policy sphere, then why not work together and then really gain the momentum and then give the thrust going forward. I guess it's going to be, well, there are resource restraints on the part of ISSP, I understand, and implementation of S1 and S2 is very important. However, getting on board on some of the new areas at an early stage is equally important. So I wish you all the luck to Emmanuel and his team, but that will be my message. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Takashi. Last but not least, as I'm conscious of time, Jean-Paul, we've heard from the big jurisdictions once again, and they clearly see the importance of trying to achieve this alignment and interoperability. But IOSCO, as you mentioned earlier, regulates over 95% of the world's securities markets, and most of those are emerging market jurisdictions. So from a global framework implementation perspective, what do you see as the key challenges?
Well, I would say, in a nutshell, there are, for me, as new IOSCO chair, 4 challenges, or maybe from a more positive point of view, opportunities, or at least factors which will be instrumental or key in achieving the desired global uptake. And it's about, of course, proportionality. Because many people in this room, people working for the GFSA, people working in the financial, that's one of the first word that we have to learn when you are engaged by a financial supervisor. It's about proportionality. That was my case 40 years ago, and it's important. Second aspect, I would say, 35 years ago, sorry. Second aspect, temporary relief for some of the disclosure requirement certainly has merit, especially from scratch, from day one. A mistake would be to think that at a global level we can be perfect from day one. Third aspect, interoperability. And last but not least, I would say capacity building. Proportionality, let us be clear. We must be able, and I think that's a common objective shared by all the people on the stage, but also in this conference room. It means that the standards must consider that the capability of the preparedness to apply them could differ, not only for small entities, let us be clear, it's an usual safe harbor for SMEs. There is no revolution for that, but also I would say for entities operating in a market where high quality external data is less elevated. That's something which is rather surprising for many of you, because normally we expect, at least if we don't have problem with fair valuation, I would say on some liquid market. Here we are discovering a new world. And we perfectly know, all of us, that it will be a challenge to find with sufficient data, sufficient quality and quantity. And that's the reason why I was so pleased to see it in the ISSB announcement last month that the ISSB took the decision to stress that it's important to be able to use reasonable, verifiable information that is available without undue cost or effort, as well as the consideration of an entity's skills, capacity, and resource. Let us be clear, that's a new word for many leaders, I would say, issuer preparers. Second aspect, temporary relief for some of the disclosure requirements. Certainly, that's also the price to pay for our global coordination. Important for me is that the trains start on time, then the speed, the size won't be the same, especially, I would say, when we have to, I would say, to develop some aspects of absence, I would say, of sufficient information. There's a well-known safe harbor. And for me, it's absolutely normal that the SEC in the paper released 500 pages released by the SEC, documentation and standards proposed by EFRAC and by European Commission upon level, stress this important and provide for sufficient safe harbor if there is a lack of information. In Japan, and it was stressed rightly by you, Prime Minister, we know the difference about, I would say, the cutoff, the 31st of March. So we need also that to take into account in order to take some decision about the precise timing of the reporting, which will be a national political legitimacy, and also, of course, what we know about Scope 3. Interoperability, I don't intend to come back to the wise comment given by my colleagues. Just to tell you, by definition, interoperability is insurmountable, because there is a main difference with what happened at the start of the ISSB. We now have the pleasure to work, I would say, with many colleagues, having launched, I would say, regional initiative, national excellent initiative. The European Commission, as stressed by Ugo, was one of the first ones to start with that. The SEC, in Japan, you have already decided to launch it in this body. So they are, in fact, if I may call it that, all good students. So by definition, how can you convince good students to use global standards is to ensure that they feel at ease, that they understand each other, and that there is interoperability. It's, for me, quite obvious by leaving sufficient room for jurisdictional specific. And last but not least, and then I come back to IOSCO, capacity building. Let us be clear. Of course, it's part of, I would say, the mission statement is the DNA. Again, I stress the fact that IOSCO, it means 130 jurisdictions and a majority of government jargon. So capacity building for me is a day-to-day, I would say, objective.
Thanks very much, Jean-Paul. We've gone close to an hour talking about approaches for developing sustainability disclosure frameworks. I take away probably three key items when we discuss that. The first one is clearly a willingness to work together to try and achieve comparability across the standards and interoperability where this is needed. The second one is ambition on all parts to try and make this happen, because there is realization that this is needed for investors, but also for society as a whole. And finally, a need to take people on a journey, both with regards to the preparers and on that front, the proportionality aspects, Jean-Paul, that you've mentioned, but also the regulators and legislators that will need to apply those rules going forward through the capacity building aspect that IOSCO and, of course, the ISSB through its capacity building strategy is currently undertaking. We had promised time for questions. I have gone through most of the English ones as we were discussing, but unfortunately I haven't learned to speak Japanese, so I might ask my colleague Makoto to take care of those.
Yes, thank you very much, Kris. So that the time is flying so quickly, so that let me ask only one question on behalf of the audience. So the question is that on the relating to the connectivity between the financial reporting and the sustainability reporting. Of course, this could be discussed between the IASB and also the ISSB in the future. But if you have any comments on this connectivity issue, please ask any volunteers, but less than 1 minute, please.
Paul?
I think, I don't know if the connectivity is the right word or not, but I think that concept is really critical, because ultimately how management implements strategies is going to play out in the financial statements. That's one of the reasons in our proposal we have part of the disclosures are applicable outside the financial statements, which is more around what are the risks, what are the strategies, and things of that variety. And other parts of the proposal are financial statement effects that have in fact occurred. So I think it is extremely important that the ecosystem be mindful of the fact that there is a connection between how management responds or whether they respond to risks and financial statement consequences that are going to play out over time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul, for your 1.5 minute response. So I think it's a time to wrap up so that I would like to hand over to the Kris, and apologies that I could pick up only one question. Apologies for that we are receiving so many questions.
Well, you've covered my koto, so with that, just please join me in thanking the panelists for participating today.
Thank you so much. We thank you to all the speakers for insightful panel discussion. This concludes the first panel discussion, and now we going to move on to the special interview. But would you please give us some minute to get ready for the stage? Thank you.